Welcome, dear listener, and thank you for joining me to hear one more tale, one more story to keep us warm at night. It is, as always, my pleasure to read for you The Hunt by Henry Kuttner, narrated by Sean Charles for Nightshade Audio. Alvin Doyle came to the wizard's house with a flat, sub-nosed automatic in his pocket and murder in his heart. Luck favored him in that he had been able to trace down his cousin, Will Benson, before the executors of old Andreas Benson's estate had found the trail. Now fortune was still on his side. Benson's cabin was in a little canyon 2 miles from the village of Monk's Hollow, and the superstitions of the villagers would not allow them to go near there by night. Will Benson was next of kin to the dead Andreas Benson. If Will died, Doyle would be the inheriting legatee. Consequently, Doyle had come to Monk's Hollow, and, with a gun in his pocket, had casually inquired about his cousin, taking pains to arouse no suspicion. Will Benson was a recluse, and worse men told Doyle over their beer. They whispered wild tales of what he did at night in his cabin, where drawn blinds hid unknown terrors from the eyes of the hardy prowler, and of ominous sounds that heralded a menace unknown. But there were no more prowlers now, not since Ed Durkin, the saloon keeper, had come home one night talking about a smoky black horror that he said had squatted on the roof of Benson's cabin, watching him with flaming eyes until he had ignominiously fled. Doyle chuckled to himself, realizing that fantastic tales often grew up about a recluse. His task would be easier now, for there would be little danger of a chance that some passer-by might hear the gunshot. He had taken the precaution of hiring a black roadster of a common make for his night's journey, and his dark face was impassive as he steered the car along the rutted dirt road in the dusk. Doyle's face seldom betrayed his emotions, save by a slight tightening of his thin lips and a peculiar glazing of the cold grey eyes. He smiled, however, when the door of the cabin opened in response to his knock, and a man stepped out on the porch. But it was not a pleasant smile. Doyle recognized Will Benson from his photographs, although they had been taken nearly 20 years before. There was the same broad, high forehead, the same level stare of brooding dark eyes. The parenthetical lines about the mouth had grown deeper, and Benson's thick eyebrows were drawn together in a puzzled frown. There were silver flecks about the temples. All at once his eyes lighted. "Why, Al!" His voice was hesitant. "It's Al, isn't it? I didn't know you at first." Doyle's smile widened, but mentally he cursed his cousin's memory. He had not been sure. He had not known whether Benson would remember him. Well, it could not be helped now. He had planned 2 courses of action. One would have to be discarded now in favor of the alternative plan. He put out his hand and gripped Benson's with hypocritical cordiality. "It's Al, all right. Didn't know whether you'd remember me. It's been almost 20 years, hasn't it? I was just a kid when I last saw you. Aren't you going to ask me to come in?" An odd hesitancy was apparent in Benson's manner. He frowned, then glanced almost furtively over his shoulder, then stood aside. "Yes, of course, come in." Benson double-locked the door, Doyle noticed, as his glance swept the room. Amazement gripped him. He stood there staring. The villagers had been right in naming this the wizard's house. Dark hangings swathed the walls, their sable folds giving the chamber an elusive quality of spaciousness. Tables, chairs had been pushed back against the walls, and on the bare floor was traced an extraordinary design. Doyle searched his memory, then he recognized it. A pentagram, with its circles and six-pointed star drawn in some substance that glowed with a faint greenish light. About the pentagram, at intervals, stood intricately engraved lamps of silver metal, and within the design was a chair, a table on which a huge iron-bound book laid open, and a censer suspended from a tripod. The room of a wizard indeed. Through Doyle went a little surge of petulant anger. What would such a fool do with old Benson's fortune, should he inherit it? Probably waste it on mummery of some sort. Another thought came to Doyle. Was the murder necessary? Would it not be easier to prove Benson insane? He put the unformulated thought from him. He dared not take risks. The gun was a much surer way. Benson was watching him oddly. Surprised, eh? Well, I guess it does look rather unusual at first. I'll explain later. First, sit down and tell me about yourself, how you happened to come. He dragged a chair out from the wall. Doyle sank into it, drawing out his cigarette case. It's a long story, he said. You've been out of touch with everyone, haven't you? Your grandfather and I were talking about you just the other day. He watched Benson keenly, but the man made no move. Apparently he had not yet learned of old Benson's death. It started me wondering how— excuse me, Benson broke in. Would you mind not smoking? Doyle stared at him, then returned the cigarette to its case. Of course. Apparently Benson felt the need of an explanation. I have a rather delicate, experiment I'm working on. Even small things may endanger its success. I'm afraid you think me a poor host, Al, but you really came at an inopportune time. He hesitated, and again came that curiously furtive glance over his shoulder. Had you planned on staying here tonight? Doyle was deliberately tactful. Why, if you put it that way, I don't want to intrude. I didn't mean— No, nothing like that, Benson said hastily. Only I've started this experiment now, and I've got to finish it. Even now it's dangerous. Doyle thought quickly. The man was obviously mad. What kind of nonsense was this experiment anyway? But Doyle could not leave yet. He winked and nodded meaningfully. Expecting some company, eh, Will? Benson's pale face flushed. No, he said, you're wrong there. It's really an experiment, and a dangerous one, believe me. Look here, Al, can you go back to the village tonight? Now, and come back tomorrow? I'm really awfully pleased to see you, but well, I can't very well explain. These things always sound incredible at first. Think of it as a scientific experiment, with high explosives. Lord, I'm sorry, Doyle said quickly. I'd be glad to go back, but I can't. Something's wrong with my car. I just managed to make it up here, and I'm no mechanic. Can't we phone the village for somebody to pick me up? For a moment he held his breath. He did not believe Benson would have a telephone, but— I haven't a phone, Benson replied, gnawing at his lip. You're here now, Doyle, and I'm responsible for you. There's no danger, really, if you do as I tell you. Of course, if you want me to, I'll go in another room and read till you're finished. He paused, astonished at the curious look that came into Benson's face. God, no. You stay with me. That's the only place you'll be safe. He looked quickly over his shoulder. Doyle saw that a thick bluish coil of smoke was ascending from the censer. Come on, Benson urged, and Doyle rose, watched his cousin carry a chair within the pentagram. Slowly he followed. From somewhere, Benson produced a candle, set it in a candlestick on the table. He extinguished the oil lamp that had illuminated the room, so that the only light came from the candle and the 6 silver lamps. Shadows crept in. Outside the pentagram, a wall of darkness seemed to press forward, and the black hangings lent a disturbing air of measureless distance to the blackness. It was utterly silent. "I'd already started this," Benson explained, "and it's something that can't be stopped. It's got to run its course. Sit down. You've got a long wait." He bent over the great iron-bound book on the table, turned a yellowed page. The volume was in Latin, Doyle saw, but he knew little of the language. The pale face of Benson, brooding over the book, reminded Doyle of some medieval magician working his sorcery. Sorcery. Well, the gun in his pocket was a stronger magic than the mumbo-jumbo of half-cracked fools. Still, he would have to humor Benson. The man had an awkward habit of glancing up quickly, and Doyle had no relish for a physical conflict. The first shot must be fatal. Benson threw some powder into the censer, and the smoke rose more thickly. Gradually a faint haze was beginning to pervade the atmosphere. Doyle quickly repressed a tight smile as Benson glanced at him. "You think I'm mad, don't you?" asked Benson. "No," Doyle said, and was silent. He had gauged his opponent too well to start a stream of protestations which would inevitably ring false. Benson, smiling, leaned back, facing his cousin. From his pocket he drew a battered pipe, eyed it longingly, and thrust it back. "This is the worst of it," he said irrelevantly, and chuckled. Abruptly he grew serious. "They may have told you in the village that I'm mad, but they don't think so. They fear me, Al. God knows why, for I've never harmed them. All I'm after is knowledge, and they wouldn't understand that. But I don't mind, for it keeps them away from here, and I need solitude for my research. Besides, it keeps them from blundering in where ordinary people shouldn't be." "They call this the Wizard's House," Doyle said, anxious to agree. "Yes, I suppose so. Well, after all, they may be right. Long ago, men who sought after hidden knowledge were called wizards, but it's all science, Al. Although a science of which the ordinary man, even your conventional scientist, knows nothing. The scientist is wiser, though, for he realizes that beyond his 3-dimensional world of sight and hearing and tasting and smelling, there are other worlds with another kind of life on them. What I'm going to tell you may seem unbelievable, I know, but I must tell you, for the sake of your sanity. You must be prepared for what you're going to see tonight. Another cosmos." He pondered, glancing down at the book. "It's hard. I've gone so far, and you know so little." Doyle shifted uneasily. His hand went into his pocket and remained there as Benson looked up at him. He knew better than to jerk it out with betraying haste. "Put it this way," Benson went on. "Man isn't the only type of intelligent life. Science admits that, but it does not admit that there is a superscience which enables man to get in contact with these ultra-human entities. There has always been a hidden, necessarily furtive law, persecuted by the mob, which delves deeply into this secret wisdom. Many of the so-called wizards of ancient times were charlatans, like Cagliostro. Others, like Albertus Magnus and Ludwig Prynne, were not. Man must indeed be blind to refuse to see the unmistakable evidence of these hidden things. There was a flush creeping into Benson's cheeks as he talked, and he stabbed a slender forefinger down upon the book that lay open before him. "It's here, in the Book of Karnak, and in other books, La Très Sainte Trinosophy. the Chahaya ritual, the Dictionnaire Infernal of Diplancy, but man won't believe because he doesn't want to believe. He has forced belief from his mind. From ancient times, the only memory that has come down is fear. Fear of those ultra-human entities which once walked the earth. Well, dynamite is dangerous, but it can also be useful too. "My God," Benson exclaimed, a strange fire burning in his somber eyes. "If I had only been alive then, when the old gods walked the earth, what might I not have learned?" He caught himself, stared at Doyle almost suspiciously. A gentle hissing began to come from the sensor. Benson got up hastily to inspect the 6 lamps. They were still burning, although a curious blueness now tinged their flames. "As long as they burn, we're quite safe," he said. "As long as the pentagram is not broken." Doyle could not repress an irritable frown. Benson was mad, of course, but nevertheless Doyle was becoming nervous, and no wonder. Even a man not keyed up to high tension might well be shaken by these fantastic preparations. Benson's insane hints of monstrous, what was the term? Ultra-human entities. Doyle determined to end the grotesque comedy swiftly, and his finger caressed the trigger of the gun. "It's one of these beings that I'm summoning," Benson went on. "You must not allow yourself to be frightened, no matter what happens, for you're quite safe within the circle. I'm calling up an entity which mankind worshipped aeons ago. Iod the Hunter." Silently, Doyle listened as his cousin spoke of the secret and forgotten lore hidden in the ancient tomes and manuscripts he had studied. He had learned strange, well-nigh incredible things, Benson related, and perhaps strangest of all was the legend of Iod, the Hunter of Souls. Man had worshipped Iod in older days, under other names. He was one of the oldest gods, and he had come to Earth, the tale went, in pre-human aeons, when the old gods soared between the stars, and Earth was a stopping place for incredible voyagers. The Greeks knew him as Torphonios. The Etruscans made nameless sacrifices diurnally to Vediovis, the dweller beyond Phlegethon, the river of flame. This ancient god did not dwell on earth, and a certain apt phrase the Egyptians had coined for him meant, rendered into English, the dimension prowler. The evilly famous De Vermis Mysterious spoke of Iod as the shining pursuer who hunted souls through the secret worlds, which, Prynne hinted, meant other dimensions of space. For the soul has no spatial limitations, and it was the human soul, the Flemish magician wrote, which the ancient god hunted. It was his monstrous pleasure to hunt the soul, as a hound will course and run down a frightened rabbit. But if an adept took the necessary precautions, he could safely summon Iod, and the god would serve him in certain curious but desirable ways. Yet not even in the suppressed De Vermis Mysterious could the incantation be found which would summon the dimension prowler from his secret dwelling place. Only by diligent searching through certain half-fabulous cryptograms, the monstrous Ishaksha and the fabled Elder Key, had Benson been able to piece together the incantation which would summon the god to Earth. No man could say, moreover, what shape Iod would assume. It was whispered that he did not always retain the same form. In Rajgir, the cradle of Buddhism, the ancient Dravidians wrote with a peculiar horror of the god, "Reincarnation is a vital factor in the religions of India, and to the mind of an Indian, the only true type of death is that of the soul. The body may perish, crumble to dust, but the soul will live again in other bodies, unless it falls victim to the dreadful hunting of Iod. For Iod pursues always, Benson whispered. The soul has power to flee through the hidden worlds from the shining pursuer, but it has no power to escape. And for a human being to see the shape of Iod in all its frightful completeness, unprotected by the necessary precautions, meant swift and certain doom. There's a parallel in science, Benson concluded. Known science, I mean. The synapse gives the clue. The nerve gap over which thought impulses travel. If a barrier is erected in this gap, blocking the impulses, the result is paralysis? Rather catalepsy. Iod extracts the vital forces of being, leaving only consciousness. The brain lives, but the body dies. What the Egyptians called life in death. Wait. Doyle glanced up quickly. Benson was staring beyond the pentagram at a shadowy corner of the room. "Do you feel any change yet?" he asked. Doyle shook his head, and then hesitated. "It's cold, isn't it?" he said, frowningly. Benson stood up. "Yes, that's it. Now listen, Al. Just stay as you are. Don't move if you can help it. Whatever you do, don't leave the pentagram until I've dismissed the thing that I'm calling up. And don't interrupt me." Benson's eyes were blazing in his white face. He made a curious gesture with his left hand, and in a low, toneless voice began to chant in Latin. "Veni diabole, discalcia me, recede miser." The temperature of the room had changed. It was suddenly very cold. Doyle shuddered and stood up. Benson, his back turned, paid no heed. The incantation had become a rhymed gibberish which was in no language Doyle knew. Bagabi laka bachabe. Lamak kahi achababe. Karylos. Doyle took a stubby black automatic from his pocket, aimed it with painstaking care, and pulled the trigger. The explosion was not loud. Benson's body jerked convulsively, and he turned to stare at his cousin with astonished eyes. Doyle thrust the gun back into his pocket and stepped back. There must be no bloodstains on his clothing. He watched Benson intently. The dying man fell forward, and his body made an ugly thudding noise as it hit the floor. The arms and legs moved feebly, as though in monstrous imitation of a swimmer. Doyle hesitated, half drew the automatic. A sound from nearby made him wheel, gun lifted. From the darkness outside the pentagram came a faint whisper, a curious stirring in the dark air. It was as though a little breeze had sprung up suddenly from the silent room. Momentarily, the darkness in the corner seemed to crawl with movement. Then the whisper died. There was a tight smile on Doyle's face as he lowered the weapon, listening intently. No further sound came until a metallic clatter brought Doyle's gaze down to the floor. Benson lay sprawled, his arms outflung. Just beyond his fingers, one of the silver lamps lay overturned, its flame extinguished. In Benson's glazing eyes there was mirrored a look of malevolent amusement, and as Doyle watched, it changed and grew until the face was all alight with a sort of triumphant, unholy merriment. The expression remained fixed, and presently Doyle realized that Benson was dead. He stepped outside the pentagram, not without an involuntary shrinking, and hurriedly touched the electric switch. Then, methodically, he began to ransack the room. He had carefully refrained from leaving possible fingerprints, but now, to make doubly sure, He drew on a pair of rubber gloves. There was nothing much of value, a set of silver-backed brushes, a little jewelry, perhaps $100 in cash. Doyle stripped a sheet from the bed and made a bundle of the loot. Then he let his gaze travel over the room. It would not do now to blunder through carelessness. He nodded, switched off the light, and left the cabin. Then he found a stick and broke a window, fumbled with the latch. It opened easily. The moon was rising, and a pale shaft of radiance streamed in through the open window, made Doyle's shadow a black, misshapen blotch on the floor. He moved aside quickly, and the light fell on the white face of the dead man. Doyle stared through the window for a long moment before turning away. One thing remained undone. Half an hour later, that too was accomplished, and the loot was at the bottom of a stagnant, marshy lake 12 miles from the cabin. There was nothing now to prove that Benson had not died at the hands of a burglar. As Doyle headed his roadster towards the city, he was conscious of a feeling of tremendous relief, as though his taut nerves were at last relaxing. There was an unexpected reaction, however. Doyle began to feel very sleepy. The lethargic drowsiness that was creeping over him could not be dispelled, although he let down the windshield to allow the cool night breeze to strike his face. Twice he just avoided going off the road. At last, realizing that he dared drive no further, he drew up off the shoulder of the highway, drew a rug over his legs, and relaxed. When he awoke, it would take only a few hours to reach home. He fumbled uneasily with the rug. The night had become very cold. Icy stars seemed to watch him intently from a sky ablaze with chill brilliance. Just as he went to sleep, he imagined he heard someone laughing. Sleep that was haunted with strange, grotesque images, a feeling of dropping through giddy abysses, a horrible vertigo that passed and left him spent and helpless to the dreams that came. In his dream he was back in Benson's house. The sable hangings still swathed the walls. The pentagram still glowed faintly on the floor, but the silver lamps were no longer alight. All around were darkness and silence, and a chill wind was blowing. With the odd inconsequence of dreams, Doyle realized without any particular feeling of surprise that the room was roofless. Cold stars blazed in a jet sky. Without warning, an irregular patch of blackness sprang into existence overhead. Something, invisible save as a shapeless silhouette against the stars, was hovering over the roofless room. Looking down, Doyle saw Benson's body lying where it had fallen. The glazed eyes seemed to shine with a shocking semblance of internal light. They were not looking at him. They were staring upward, and the light that was emanating from those ghastly hollows was actually beating back the darkness of the room. And now Doyle saw that something like a thick, knotted rope was descending from above. It paused above the dead man's face, coiling and wriggling with a slow, worm-like motion. Following the rope with his eyes, Doyle saw that it disappeared in the black patch of shadow far above, and he was oddly glad that his eyes could not pierce the gloom that shrouded the hovering thing. Very slowly, the lids of Benson's eyes began to close. There was no other movement in the still white face, save for the almost imperceptible shutting of the eyelids. At last they were completely closed. Doyle saw the black rope move, twisting and coiling restlessly across the room toward him, and slowly a dim radiance began to glow overhead. It waxed and grew until the stars were dim ghosts against its splendor, and then it began to drop silently through the air, slanting toward Doyle as it sank. Stark horror gripped the man. He tried to fling himself back and found that he could not move. Some strange dream paralysis held him rigid and helpless, and in the pale radiance above him he caught a glimpse of a vague amorphous shape that swam slowly into view. The rope thing came on. Doyle made a sudden, frightful effort to move, to break the invisible bonds that fettered him, and this time he was successful. The paralysis fled away. He whirled to escape and saw before him emptiness. A gulf of blackness seemed to open abruptly at his feet, and he felt himself toppling forward. There was a jarring shock, a wrenching jolt that utterly confused all his faculties at once. For a second, Doyle felt himself plummeting down into a gulf of utter abandon, and then grey light enveloped him. The roofless room was gone. Both Benson and the floating horror had vanished. He was in another world, another dream world. This weird feeling of unreality. Doyle stared about him, discovering that he was bathed in a grey, shadowless light that came from no visible source, while overhead the air thickened into a misty, opaque haze. Curious little crystal formations speckled the flat plain about him, a conglomeration of glinting, flashing light. Extraordinary balloon-like creatures, as large as his head, swung ceaselessly in the air all around him, drifting gently with the air currents. They were perfectly round, covered with flashing reptilian scales. One of them burst as he watched, and a cloud of tiny glowing motes floated slowly down. When they touched the ground, a strange crystalline growth began to form as the motes were metamorphosed into the little crystals that stretched into the hazy distance about him. Above the man, a dim glow began to wax, a pale, lambent radiance that Doyle watched apprehensively for a few moments before realizing its significance. He recognized it finally as he began to make out vaguely disquieting formations in the brightness, and without warning, a black coil dropped down purposefully, questing for him. Doyle felt a cold shock of dreadful fear. Would this dream never end? The strange paralysis held him again. He tried to cry out, but no sound came from his stiff lips, and just before the worm-like tip of the tentacle touched him, he remembered his former escape and made a frantic effort to break his intangible bonds. And again the black abyss widened at his feet. Again came the wrenching jar as he plummeted down, and again the dark veil was withdrawn to disclose a fantastic alien scene. All about him was a tangled forest of luxuriant vegetation, the bark of the trees, as well as the leaves, the thick masses of vines. Even the grass underfoot was an angry, brilliant crimson. Nor was that the worst. The things were alive. The vines writhed and swung on the trees, and the trees themselves swayed restlessly, their branches twisting in the hot, stagnant air. Even the long, fleshy grass at Doyle's feet made nauseating little worm motions. There was no sun, merely an empty blue sky, incongruously peaceful above the writhing horrors. Doyle saw a crimson snake-like vine as thick as his arm dart out toward him, and he made again that desperate effort to move. At the same moment he saw the nucleus of a familiar glow pulsing through the air above him. Then the blackness overwhelmed him briefly, and it passed to reveal still another world. He was in a vast towering amphitheatre, vaguely reminiscent of the Colosseum, but far larger. Tiers of seats rose into the distance, and filling the rows was a surging multitude. There was a square of space separating him from the first row of seats, and on this space 4 creatures stood facing him. They were monsters, inhuman and terrible. Set atop fat, puffy, dark-skinned bags were shapeless globes, dead black, save for peculiar whitish markings which followed no particular pattern. From a gaping hole in each globe dangled a string of pale ribbon-like appendages, and just above this orifice was a pale glossy disc with an intensely black centre. The bodies, Doyle saw, were clothed in some black substance, so that only their general anthropoid contour was revealed. He caught a glimpse of unfamiliar appendages protruding through the clothing, but their various purposes were obscure. One long proboscis resembled the miniature trunk of an elephant, and it hung from where the navel should have been. Another short, dangling flap had an ovoid swelling on it. The worst revelation of all, however, occurred when one of the things lifted up an arm, and from the gaping cavity that was revealed, a pinkish tongue lolled forth lazily. About Doyle a murmuring grew and swelled into a roar. The throngs in the distant seats were cavorting, dancing. The 4 nearby were waving their repulsive appendages and coming closer. Above Doyle a spot of light appeared, grew larger. As he watched, it began to glow with that strange brilliant flame he had come to dread. The 4 nearby scurried ignominiously to a safe distance. But this time Doyle was ready, his flesh crawling at the sight of the horror materializing within the light. He tensed. It was not such an effort this time, somehow, and again he was plummeting into blackness. From the colourless void he emerged into the glaring blaze of a vast field of frozen white, with not an object visible in its limitless expanse, and a black starless sky overhead. Abysmal cold seared Doyle to the bone, the utter chill of airless space. He did not wait for the coming of the pursuer to make the effort of his will that sent him into yet another world. Then he was standing on a black gelatinous substance that heaved restlessly underfoot as though it were the hide of some cyclopean monster. The ebony, heaving skin seemed to stretch for miles around. Presently the warning light was fused in the air above Doyle. Shuddering, he fled through the shielding darkness. Next was a field of hard frozen brown earth with a phenomenally beautiful night sky overhead, studded with unfamiliar constellations, with a great comet blazing in its white glory among the stars. And from that world Doyle fled to a strange place where he stood on a surface of ice or glass. Looking down, he could see, far below, vague and indistinct figures that were apparently frozen or buried there, colossal shapes that seemed entirely inhuman, as far as he could make out through the cloudy crystalline substance. The next vision was by far the worst. From the swift plunge into blackness, Doyle emerged to find about him a great city, towering upward to a black sky in which blazed 2 angry scarlet moons, whose flight he could almost follow with his eyes. It was a colossal and shocking city of scalene black towers and fortresses, which seemed to follow some abnormal and anomalous system of geometry. It was in its entirety an indescribable conglomeration of stone horrors, and its architectural insanity sent sharp pains darting through Doyle's eyes as he tried to follow the impossible planes and angles. Then Doyle caught a flashing glimpse of the amorphous nightmare inhabitants that teemed loathsomely in that gigantic city, and a dreadful horror raked him. He flung himself desperately into the black gulf that once more awaited him. He seemed to fall for endless aeons through the limitless abyss. Then suddenly he found himself gasping and sweating in his roadster, while the shadowy darkness before the dawn made silhouettes of nearby trees. Trembling, Doyle groped for the dashboard compartment. His throat was dry, and he had a piercing headache. He needed a drink. His hand closed on the bottle. Then he paused. An inexplicable light was shining down on him. Doyle dropped back upon the cushions, his eyes dilated with unbelieving terror, and slowly, from empty air that pulsed with the straining of cosmic forces, a monstrous entity began to emerge. Gradually it swam into view from a blaze of blinding light, until Doyle saw hovering above him the star spawn of an alien and forgotten dimension, Iod, the Hunter of Souls. It was not a homogeneous entity, this unholy spectre, but it partook hideously of incongruous elements. Strange mineral and crystalline formations sent their fierce glow through squamous, semi-transparent flesh, and the whole was bathed in a viscid, crawling light that pulsed monstrously about the horror. A thin slime dripped from membranous flesh to the car's hood, and as this slime floated down, hideous, plant-like appendages writhed blindly in the air, making hungry little sucking noises. It was a blazing cosmic horror, spawned by an outlaw universe, an abysmal pre-human entity drawn out of fathomless antiquity by elder magic. A great faceted eye watched Doyle emotionlessly, with the cold stare of the Midgard serpent, and the rope-like tentacle began to uncoil purposefully as the thing advanced. Doyle made a tremendous effort to break the invisible bonds that had again fettered him. He strained and struggled till his temples throbbed with agony, but nothing happened, save that from a puckered orifice on the rugose lower surface of the creature there issued a high-pitched whistling. Then the tentacle swung up, and its tip darted out like a snake for Doyle's face. He felt a frigid touch on his forehead, and the iron agony of fathomless cold bit into his brain. In an incandescent blaze of light, the world flared up and was gone, and a ghastly suction began to drag inexorably at Doyle's brain. The life was drained from him in one hideous tide of pain. Then the agony in his head lessened and was gone. There was a brief, shrill whistling that seemed to recede reluctantly as though into vast distances, and Doyle was left alone in the midst of a brooding, oppressive silence. Save for the motionless figure in the car, the road was empty. Alvin Doyle made a move to lift his arm, and found that he could not stir. With chill horror creeping over him, he tried to shriek, to call for help, but no sound came from his frozen lips. Suddenly he thought of the words of Benson. Iod extracts the vital forces of being, leaving only consciousness. The brain lives, but the body dies. Life in death. Doyle slipped into temporary oblivion, and when he awakened, he found the car surrounded by a dozen onlookers. A man in a khaki uniform was doing something with a mirror. In answer to a question Doyle had not heard, the man shook his head somberly. "No, he's quite dead, all right. Look at that." He exhibited the mirror. "See?" Doyle tried to shriek, to tell them that he lived, but his lips and tongue were paralyzed. He could make no sound. There was no sensation in his body. he was not conscious of its existence. Slowly the faces around him receded into white blurs, and the thunder of madness roared relentlessly in his ears. It was a strangely rhythmic thunder, a series of jarring shocks, the hollow thud of clods falling on a coffin, the utter panic of an existence that was neither life nor death.